The morning sun poured gently over the manicured lawns of Willow Creek, casting golden light across the neat rows of suburban homes. It was the kind of neighborhood where neighbors waved to each other from across driveways, and the hum of distant created a comforting rhythm. For the narrator and his wife, Laura, Willow Creek was more than just a collection of houses. It was a place they had chosen to build their life, a retreat from the chaos of the city. Their home, a two-story with soft beige siding and crisp white trim, stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, flanked by flowering dogwoods and neatly trimmed hedges. Laura stepped out onto the front porch, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands, and inhaled the cool morning air. The day promised calm and routine. She watched as their neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Jacobs, walked their golden retriever along the sidewalk, chatting cheerfully about weekend plans. Everything seemed ordinary, almost perfect. But beneath the surface of this idyllic neighborhood, an undercurrent of tension ran quietly, one that most residents spoke of in hushed tones. It was Ms., the homeowners association manager, who maintained a constant presence that many found both impressive and unsettling. She was tall, with a sharp, precise appearance, her gray hair always perfectly styled, and a gaze that seemed to catch everything. Residents often joked in a nervous way that she had eyes everywhere. Ms.'s reputation for strict rule enforcement preceded her. She was known to inspect lawns for weeds, fences for peeling paint, and even mailbox flags for proper alignment. Most homeowners silently, preferring a cordial nod or a quick apology to the risk of confrontation. Laura and her husband had never had serious trouble with the HOA. They kept their property in impeccable condition, planting seasonal flowers, repainting trim when necessary, and even repainting their front door when Ms. had casually commented it looked slightly faded. Yet, even with their care, the couple could not ignore the feeling that Ms.'s attention went beyond ordinary oversight. The stories circulated quietly among neighbors: unexpected inspections, sudden fines for minor infractions, and visits that seemed to appear at the most inconvenient times. That morning, as Laura sipped her coffee, she noticed Ms. moving down the street, clipboard in hand, her gaze sweeping over the houses with meticulous precision. She paused briefly at the house across the cul-de-sac, scribbling something in her notebook before moving on. Laura felt a familiar twinge of unease. While nothing had directly affected them yet, the presence of someone so vigilant and so unwavering in her authority was hard to ignore. Her husband, Michael, joined her on the porch, a casual smile on his face. "She's at it again," he said, nodding toward Ms. Figure walking steadily down the street. Laura laughed softly, though the unease lingered. "At least it's not our house today," she replied. They both knew it was only a matter of time before her attention landed on them, even if they had done nothing wrong. As they talked about plans for the weekend, a sense of tension mingled with the calm of the morning. They were proud homeowners, committed to maintaining both the beauty of their property and the harmony of their neighborhood, yet they were acutely aware that living under constant scrutiny could be exhausting. They had heard enough stories to understand that Ms.'s concept of order sometimes blurred the line between oversight and intrusion. For now, however, the day remained peaceful. Birds chirped in the trees, the scent of blooming flowers filled the air, and neighbors went about their routines. Laura and Michael took solace in the quiet, enjoying the warmth of their porch and the promise of a day without disruption. Yet deep down, a small warning bell rang faintly in Laura's mind. A subtle reminder that in Willow Creek, perfection came with a watchful eye, and even the most careful homeowners could be caught off guard. As the morning progressed, Laura finished her coffee, set the mug on the table, and glanced down the street once more. Ms. had disappeared from view, but the lingering feeling of being observed remained. The quiet of the neighborhood was comforting, yet beneath it lay a tension that no amount of sunshine could fully dispel. And somewhere, without warning, that tension was poised to take a more tangible form. The following afternoon, Laura decided to tend to the flower beds along the front walkway. She knelt in the soft soil, planting fresh marigolds and carefully trimming stray leaves, all while enjoying the warmth of the sun on her shoulders. The garden had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in the rhythm of planting and pruning, away from the quiet tension that often lingered in the neighborhood. As she worked, a shadow crossed her vision. Glancing up, she saw Ms. standing across the street, her clipboard tucked firmly under one arm. She was studying the homes with that same exacting scrutiny that had unsettled Laura before. Ms. Sharp gaze eventually landed on Laura's property, lingering just a little too long for comfort. Her lips pressed together, forming a thin line, and she scribbled something in her notebook with rapid, deliberate strokes. Laura straightened, instinctively brushing soil from her hands. "Hello," she called softly, attempting a friendly tone, though her unease was rising. Miz's eyes flicked toward her, and she gave a small nod, not quite a greeting, more a signal that she had taken notice. Then, without another word, she turned and continued down the sidewalk, occasionally glancing back over her shoulder. When Michael returned from running errands, he immediately sensed the tension in Laura's posture. "You're on edge," he observed, helping her move a watering can aside. She explained what she had seen, and he frowned, running a hand through his hair. "She's persistent, isn't she?" he said. "Even if we haven't done anything, she seems to find ways to make her presence felt." Their discussion was interrupted by the doorbell. Michael opened the door to find a neighbor, Mr. standing there with a cautious smile. "You're not imagining it," he said quietly. "Ms. been circling the cul-de-sac again. She's asking questions about everyone's lawn and driveway. She's been especially interested in your house." Laura's heart sank. While she had been aware of Ms. Vigilance, hearing that her neighbors were noticing the same pattern made it feel less like coincidence and more like deliberate observation. Mr. lingered for a moment, lowering his voice. "I don't want to worry you, but some of us think she's been pushing boundaries lately. You might want to keep an eye on her." After he left, Michael and Laura went over the HOA rules once more. They reviewed the sections about inspections, noticing the clear language that representatives could not enter a homeowner's property without consent except in emergencies. "It's in writing," Michael said, tapping the page. "She doesn't have the authority to just walk in." Despite this knowledge, the sense of unease persisted. Laura found herself checking the windows more often, noticing every unusual movement on the street. She became of shadows crossing her lawn, the faint creak of gates, and the distant hum of cars driving past. Even the casual rustle of leaves seemed to carry a new weight. That evening, while preparing dinner, Laura glanced through the kitchen window. Across the street, Ms. had stopped near a neighbor's house, kneeling to inspect what appeared to be a small crack in the driveway. She wrote something down and then looked directly toward Laura's window, as if confirming that her presence had been acknowledged. A chill ran through Laura, not from fear but from the sudden clarity that Miz's attention was no longer casual. It was intentional. Michael noticed her concern and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We've been careful. We follow the rules and we know our rights. She can't just take over our property," he said firmly. His words were comforting, yet Laura couldn't shake the feeling that the days of calm were numbered. As night fell and the neighborhood quieted, Laura found herself checking the locks on the doors, making sure everything was secure. The once tranquil street now felt charged with anticipation, the faint shadows of evening stretching longer, hinting that the intrusion of order she had tolerated from a distance might soon become personal. Somewhere in the distance, a lone car drove past, headlights briefly illuminating the trimmed lawns, a reminder that even in perfect neighborhoods, vigilance was sometimes necessary. Laura closed the blinds, her thoughts restless. She had always believed in harmony, in neighborly respect, yet a single presence had begun to cast a shadow over the peace she cherished. And she knew, even as she tried to focus on the small tasks of daily life, that Miz's attention was far from finished. The next morning started like any other. Laura was in the kitchen preparing breakfast while Michael read the newspaper at the table. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the room, and the soft hum of birds outside suggested a calm day. For a moment, the tension of the past few days seemed to fade. Yet neither of them could fully shake the uneasy feeling that had been building ever since Miz's lingering visits. It was mid-morning when the first knock came at the door. Laura paused, wiping her hands on a towel. The sound was deliberate, measured, and almost formal. She glanced through the peephole and saw Ms. standing there, clipboard in hand, her expression composed but firm. There was no hint of greeting, only that unmistakable air of authority. Laura opened the door cautiously. "Good morning, Ms.," she said, forcing a neutral tone. "Is there something we can help you with?" "I need to conduct an inspection," Ms. replied, her voice smooth but commanding. "It's required under the HOA guidelines, and I need access to the property today." Laura's heart sank. She had reviewed the rules, knew her rights, and understood that no HOA representative could enter her home without consent unless there was an emergency. Yet, the boldness of Ms. standing on her porch, clipboard in hand, was unnerving. "I'm afraid you'll have to make an appointment," Laura said, keeping her tone calm but firm. "We're available for inspections, but only with prior notice. This isn't an emergency." Ms.'s eyes narrowed slightly. "This is my responsibility," she said. "I am authorized to access the property as needed. Your cooperation is expected." Laura took a step back, her instincts telling her that this situation was escalating. "I understand your position," she said slowly, "but the rules are clear. You may not enter our home without permission unless it is an emergency. I'm happy to schedule a proper time for an inspection." For a moment, there was silence. Ms. gaze swept over the house, lingering on the windows, the neatly trimmed lawn, and the flower beds Laura had spent hours tending. She seemed to be measuring, calculating, as if trying to find a reason to challenge the refusal. Finally, she spoke again. "I would advise you to reconsider," she said, her tone low and controlled, almost a warning. "Sometimes cooperation is the easiest way to avoid complications." Laura's stomach tightened. She sensed the underlying pressure in Ms.'s words. She had seen this before, heard stories from neighbors about the subtle tactics used to make homeowners feel guilty or obligated. It was part of the aura of control that Ms. carried, a way to bend rules without technically breaking them, at least in her mind. Michael appeared behind Laura, his presence steadying her. He crossed his arms and met Ms.'s gaze. "We are following the rules," he said calmly. "There will be no entry without our consent. Please leave the property, and we can arrange an inspection at a mutually convenient time." For a moment, Ms. looked as though she might argue further. Then, with a tight smile, she straightened, tipped her head slightly, and backed down, at least for now. "Very well," she said, turning toward the sidewalk. "I'll be back. Remember that cooperation is expected." As her heels clicked against the pavement and she walked away, Laura exhaled, feeling a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. Michael closed the door, locking it carefully, and turned toward her. "That was close," he said. "She's bold, and I think she'll try again. We need to be ready." Laura nodded. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden clarity that this was no longer a casual oversight issue. Ms.'s persistence and sense of authority made it clear that she intended to push boundaries. This encounter had escalated from distant observation to a direct attempt to assert control over their home. The couple spent the rest of the day reviewing every detail of HOA regulations and local laws regarding property access. They documented the morning encounter meticulously, noting time, statements, and Ms.'s behavior. Laura also reached out discreetly to a few neighbors who had mentioned similar experiences, learning that she was not the first to face such pressure. As evening approached, the quiet neighborhood settled into the usual rhythm. Children played on the sidewalks, dogs barked in the distance, and the scent of dinner wafted through open windows. Yet for Laura and Michael, the sense of safety had shifted. Their home, once a sanctuary of calm and routine, now felt like a stage for an inevitable confrontation. Laura stood by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. Somewhere down the road, a shadow of authority moved quietly, and she knew that the next encounter would be critical. The realization settled in. This was not simply about compliance or rules. It was about defending the boundaries of their home, and they were about to face a test they could not ignore. The following day, Michael and Laura spent the morning reviewing HOA documents in detail, determined to understand the limits of Ms.'s authority. They had always with the association's rules, keeping the lawn manicured, painting the trim, and maintaining the flower beds. But the previous morning's encounter had made it clear that compliance alone might not be enough. Laura flipped through the HOA handbook again, her finger tracing the words carefully. "Here," she said, pointing to a passage. "It says here that representatives may not enter private property without consent except in emergencies. That's non-negotiable." Michael nodded, leaning back in his chair. "So, she has no legal right to use that master key of hers. Not for inspections, not for anything else. We're on solid ground if we stand firm." Despite the reassurance from the rulebook, a sense of unease lingered. The couple realized that Ms. Confidence came not just from knowledge of the rules, but from her ability to make homeowners doubt themselves. Her presence alone seemed to intimidate people into compliance. "I want to make sure we're protected," Laura said. "Let's confirm with local authorities just to be certain." Michael agreed. They contacted the non-emergency line for the local police department and explained the situation. A calm, professional officer listened carefully as Laura described Ms.'s repeated visits, her attempt to enter the home without consent, and her insistence on immediate access. The officer confirmed what they had suspected. HOA representatives had no legal right to enter a private residence without permission unless there was a clear and immediate emergency. "That's good to know," Michael said, relief mingled with tension in his voice. "So any further attempts would be considered trespassing, even if she claims authority." The officer suggested documenting each encounter carefully, noting dates, times, and what was said. Michael and Laura also agreed to keep a visual record when possible, taking photographs from inside the home or recording interactions without confrontation. They wanted to ensure they had evidence if the situation escalated. Later that afternoon, Laura decided to speak discreetly with a few neighbors she trusted. She learned that several households had experienced similar visits, some more aggressive than others. The pattern was clear. Ms. had been testing boundaries, subtly pressuring residents while claiming the right to enforce rules. "Everyone's talking about it," said Mrs., one of the neighbors. "Some people just let her in because they're scared of fines or conflict, but she shouldn't have that kind of influence over your home." Laura felt a mix of frustration and resolve. She understood the delicate balance required, maintaining civility in the neighborhood while standing firm against someone who had begun to overstep. She knew that ignoring the problem would only embolden Ms. That evening, as the couple prepared dinner, Michael glanced at Laura. "We can't let her control us. We follow the rules, we know our rights, and we document everything. That's how we protect ourselves." Laura nodded. She appreciated his calm approach, but the weight of the situation was undeniable. They were dealing with someone who had made a habit of testing limits, and she suspected that Ms. would not simply accept being refused access. After dinner, Laura returned to the front porch for a few moments of quiet. The street was bathed in golden evening light, children's laughter echoing faintly from a nearby cul-de-sac. Yet, even in the midst of this ordinary calm, Laura's gaze drifted to the end of the street, half expecting to see Ms.'s familiar figure. It was in that quiet moment that she realized how important preparation would be. Their home was their sanctuary, and no one, even someone with authority in the HOA, could compromise it. She thought about neighbors who had silently endured similar pressure and felt a surge of determination. She would not let fear dictate her actions. Laura made a mental list of steps. Continue documenting everything, maintain communication with authorities, and be prepared for any attempt at entry. Most importantly, she and Michael would stand firm together, united in protecting their home and each other. As night fell, the streetlights cast long shadows across the trimmed lawns. The neighborhood appeared peaceful, almost perfectly ordinary. Yet beneath that calm, the tension lingered, a quiet warning that the next encounter with Ms. could be more than a verbal confrontation. Laura and Michael were readying themselves for what was coming, knowing that vigilance, knowledge, and careful planning were their best defenses. For the first time, they felt not just unease, but a quiet confidence. They understood the rules, they had allies in neighbors and authorities, and they were prepared to stand their ground. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine just how far Ms. would push her authority, and whether their home could remain their safe haven. The next morning, the sun had barely risen when a familiar figure appeared at the end of the driveway. Laura, already on edge after the previous day's research and neighbor conversations, caught sight of Ms. walking toward their home. She carried her clipboard like a shield, and moved with that deliberate, confident stride that seemed to announce authority without words. Laura's heart quickened, but she didn't panic. She had prepared for this. She alerted Michael with a discreet glance, and he appeared behind her in the kitchen doorway, calm but alert. Together, they moved toward the front door, their shared resolve fortifying them against the tension rising in the morning air. When Laura opened the door, Ms. stood there, her posture rigid and her expression carefully neutral. "Good morning," Laura said evenly. "How can we help you today?" Ms. glanced at the flowers and the neatly trimmed lawn, her eyes briefly lingering on minor details before returning to Laura. "I am here to conduct a routine inspection," she said. "I will need access to the property immediately." Laura felt a flash of frustration but forced herself to remain calm. "As we've discussed, inspections must be scheduled in advance," she replied. "This is not an emergency, so I cannot grant entry at this time." Ms. lips pressed together for a fraction longer than necessary. "Your cooperation is expected," she said evenly, though there was a subtle sharpness beneath the surface. "This is part of your responsibility as a homeowner in the community." Michael stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Laura's shoulder. "We are following the rules," he said firmly. "You will not enter without our consent. We can schedule a proper inspection, but that is the only way forward." For a tense moment, the air between them felt charged, as if the quiet neighborhood had been replaced by an invisible courtroom. Ms. gaze swept over the home, lingering on the windows and door before settling back on Laura and Michael. She seemed to measure every detail, weighing the potential to push further against the knowledge that she had been refused. Finally, Ms.'s voice softened slightly, though it retained an edge of warning. "Very well," she said, straightening her posture. "I will leave for now, but remember, inspections are part of maintaining order. Resistance may complicate matters." She turned on her heels, her shoes clicking against the walkway, and walked away without another word. The moment her figure disappeared around the corner, Laura closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. Michael followed, rubbing his hands over his face before turning to her. "She's persistent, but she backed down," he said. "That's what counts. We hold the line, and we don't give her any reason to escalate further." Laura nodded, though a thread of unease lingered. The encounter had been stressful, and Ms.'s words carried an unmistakable suggestion of future attempts. The couple realized that while they had successfully stood firm, this was only one skirmish in what could become a prolonged struggle. They spent the rest of the day carefully documenting the encounter, noting the time, statements made, and Ms.'s behavior. Each detail was recorded in a notebook reserved for such instances, a record they could use if needed. Laura also took care to make a few discreet observations from inside the house, capturing photographs from windows without confronting Ms. directly. Later, they spoke with a few neighbors who had witnessed parts of the morning encounter from a distance. Some offered quiet words of encouragement, while others admitted to being too intimidated to stand up for themselves. Hearing their experiences reinforced the couple's decision to remain vigilant and prepared. They were not alone in facing Ms.'s exacting oversight, and community awareness seemed to be slowly building. That evening, Laura and Michael sat together on the porch, reflecting on the events of the day. The street was quiet, the sun dipping low behind the rooftops, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. Children played at the far end of the cul-de-sac, their laughter carrying faintly through the air, a reminder of the ordinary life they were determined to protect. "We did the right thing," Michael said, his voice steady. "We didn't overreact and we didn't give her an opening. We stayed calm and documented everything." Laura nodded, feeling a measure of reassurance. Standing firm had been difficult but necessary. She knew that vigilance, knowledge of the rules, and mutual support were their strongest defenses. Ms. might continue to test boundaries, but they were ready to meet each challenge with clarity and composure. As the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across the lawns, Laura felt a mix of resolve and anticipation. The next encounter could come at any time, and she understood that being prepared was just as important as standing firm. Their home, their sanctuary, was not just a place of comfort. It was a line they would defend together, with patience, strategy, and unwavering resolve. Over the next few days, Laura found herself increasingly focused on understanding the full extent of Ms.'s behavior. While her visits had been unnerving, she suspected that there was more to the pattern than casual inspections. Determined to be fully prepared, she began researching past incidents, quietly speaking with neighbors and reviewing records of HOA meetings and communications. She started with the neighborhood bulletin board, where past announcements and meeting notes were archived. At first, the document seemed routine, updates about landscaping guidelines, parking regulations, and upcoming social events. But as Laura read more closely, she noticed subtle hints of patterns. Repeated fines issued for minor infractions, notes about compliance checks that seemed to happen without prior warning, and references to homeowners who had been reminded of their responsibilities multiple times. Curious and cautious, Laura reached out to a few neighbors who had previously mentioned discomfort with Ms. visits. They spoke in hushed tones, clearly relieved to share their experiences. One neighbor explained how she had been called repeatedly for small issues that were technically compliant with HOA rules. Another described a late-night knock on the door that had left her shaken, despite her home being in perfect condition. As Laura listened, a clear picture began to emerge. Ms. Pattern was consistent. She targeted homes she considered high-profile, used the threat of fines or enforcement to intimidate residents, and relied on the authority of her position to push boundaries. Each story added weight to Laura's understanding of the situation, and the unease she had felt for weeks transformed into clarity. This was not random behavior. It was systematic, and it often relied on homeowners being unprepared or unaware of their rights. That evening, Laura shared her findings with Michael, who listened intently. "So it's not just about us," he said, his brow furrowed. "She's been doing this for a while, testing boundaries and seeing who will back down." Laura nodded. "Exactly. And that's why we need to be ready. We have to document everything, involve the authorities if needed, and make sure we're not giving her an opening." They began creating a plan. Every encounter would be recorded with dates, times, and details carefully noted. They agreed that they would not confront her aggressively but would maintain calm, assertive boundaries. Their goal was simple: protect their home, assert their rights, and ensure that no intimidation could take hold. Michael also suggested they consider speaking to a legal advisor, someone familiar with property law and homeowners association regulations. Laura agreed. They wanted to make sure that every step they took was supported by knowledge, not just instinct. Preparation, she realized, was their strongest defense. The next morning, while checking the mail, Laura noticed Ms. walking down the street, clipboard in hand, her usual confident stride unfaltering. Laura felt a momentary twinge of anxiety, but it was tempered by resolve. She knew they were ready for her next move. Throughout the day, they continued documenting and preparing. Laura reached out to a few neighbors who had been hesitant to speak before, encouraging them to be aware of their rights and to keep records of any encounters. Michael monitored HOA announcements for any sudden changes in policy or new enforcement measures. Together, they created a small network of vigilance, neighbors who quietly were learning that standing firm and documenting behavior could protect their homes and their peace of mind. By evening, Laura felt a cautious sense of control. The knowledge of Ms. Pattern, combined with their preparation, had transformed anxiety into strategy. She no longer felt entirely at the mercy of someone else's authority. Each step they took reinforced their confidence, and she could see that this approach would not only protect their home, but also set an example for others who might face similar pressure. As the sun set, casting warm shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns, Laura and Michael sat on their porch, quietly reflecting. They had uncovered the pattern, understood the risks, and prepared a method to respond calmly and decisively. The next encounter with Ms. was inevitable, but they were ready. Their home, their sanctuary, would not be compromised. Not now, not ever. In that quiet evening, the couple understood something profound. Knowledge, preparation, and unity were far more powerful than intimidation. They had turned fear into strategy, and the coming confrontation would show that standing firm was not only possible but necessary. The next morning, the air felt unusually heavy. Laura noticed the stillness on the street as she prepared breakfast, the usual hum of activity seeming muted. Her eyes, trained by weeks of vigilance, flicked toward the end of the driveway. It didn't take long to spot Ms., her posture as composed and confident as ever, walking purposefully toward their home. Laura's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had been preparing for this moment, gathering documentation, confirming legal rights, and mentally rehearsing how to handle the situation. When Michael joined her in the kitchen, she gave him a brief nod. They were ready. The knock on the door came mid-morning, deliberate and firm. Laura approached the door slowly, her hand steady as she turned the knob. On the porch, Ms. stood, clipboard in hand, her expression carefully neutral. She exuded the same air of authority that had unsettled the couple for weeks. "Good morning," Laura said evenly. "How can we help you today?" Ms. gaze swept over the home, lingering for a brief moment on the flower beds and trimmed lawn before returning to Laura. "I am here to conduct an inspection," she stated, her voice smooth and commanding. "Immediate access to the property is required." Laura's stomach tightened, but she held her ground. "As we've explained before, inspections must be scheduled. This is not an emergency. You may not enter without our consent." Ms. lips pressed into a thin line. For a fraction of a second, there was tension in the air as if the street itself were holding its breath. She opened her mouth to speak, but Laura calmly interrupted, stepping slightly forward. "Ms., we have documentation of our previous interactions, and we have confirmed with local authorities that you do not have the legal right to enter our home without consent," Laura said firmly. "Please leave the property." For a moment, Ms.'s eyes flickered with surprise, her usual composure shaken just enough to reveal uncertainty. She seemed to realize that this encounter would not be like the others. Laura's calm confidence and prepared stance created a boundary she could not easily cross. Before Ms. could respond further, Michael spoke from behind Laura. "We have also contacted the authorities about repeated attempts to enter without permission. Any further attempts will be considered trespassing." Ms.'s mouth opened as if to argue, but the sound of sirens approached from down the street. Police vehicles rounded the corner, lights flashing, and officers stepped from their cars with quiet authority. Laura had called in advance, ensuring that any escalation would be met swiftly and decisively. The presence of law enforcement changed everything. Ms.'s stance stiffened, her confident air replaced with sudden caution. The officers spoke briefly with Laura and Michael, confirming the situation, and then approached Ms. After a calm but firm exchange, she was informed that repeated attempts to enter private property without consent could not be tolerated, and she was taken into custody for further investigation. The entire encounter had lasted only minutes, yet it felt monumental. Laura and Michael watched as Ms. was led away, her clipboard left behind on the walkway. The relief that flooded them was profound. The tension that had built over weeks, sometimes quietly and sometimes sharply, dissipated in an instant. Their home, once shadowed by uncertainty, felt whole again. Neighbors emerged from their homes, some cautiously, others with smiles of support. Quiet murmurs of admiration and relief spread down the street as the reality of the situation sank in. For the first time, many realized that standing firm, armed with knowledge and preparation, could protect not only one household but the entire community. Laura and Michael remained on their porch, watching the police vehicles disappear around the corner. They exchanged a quiet smile, a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. They had done more than defend their home. They had set an example of calm, strategic resistance to unwarranted pressure. The rest of the day passed in a newfound tranquility. The neighborhood resumed its usual rhythm, children played on the sidewalks, and the gentle hum of cars returning home filled the air. Yet for Laura and Michael, the day marked a turning point. They had faced the intrusion, documented every step, and emerged with their home and peace intact. As evening approached, Laura leaned back in her chair, feeling a deep sense of calm. Michael joined her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We did it," he said softly. "We stood our ground and it worked." Laura nodded, her gaze resting on the quiet street. The ordeal had been exhausting, but it had strengthened their resolve and confidence. Their home was safe, their boundaries respected, and the neighborhood, though cautious, had learned a powerful lesson. Vigilance, preparation, and unity could overcome intimidation. The days following Ms.'s removal from the neighborhood unfolded with a calm that felt almost unreal. For weeks, Laura and Michael had lived under a cloud of tension, their home the center of an ongoing struggle. Now, with the confrontation resolved, the street seemed brighter, lighter, and more welcoming. Neighbors who had once kept their concerns to themselves began stopping by more openly, some carrying plates of cookies or warm smiles, others simply expressing gratitude. "You stood up when many of us couldn't," one neighbor said quietly, her voice thick with relief. "Because of you, we all feel safer." Laura accepted the words with humility. She had not set out to become a symbol of resistance, but in standing her ground, she had discovered the quiet strength of her own voice. Michael, too, noticed the difference. The air of unease that once lingered in the cul-de-sac had been replaced with a sense of community and shared resilience. The Homeowners Association, shaken by the incident, held an emergency meeting a week later. This time, the atmosphere was different. Attendance was higher than usual, and residents spoke with a clarity and assertiveness that had not been present before. There was a collective determination to ensure that oversight would never again cross into intrusion. A new system of accountability was proposed. Inspections would require clear scheduling, all communication would be logged, and every homeowner would be made fully aware of their rights. No single individual would hold unchecked authority. The proposals were met with nods of agreement and quiet applause. For the first time in months, Laura felt the association was acting as it should, fair, transparent, and respectful. At home, the couple found themselves returning to routines they had once taken for granted. Morning coffee on the porch felt, walks through the neighborhood more relaxed. Even simple tasks like tending the garden carried a new weight of meaning. Their home was more than wood and brick. It was a sanctuary, a place they had defended not only for themselves, but for the principle of privacy and peace. Laura reflected often on the lessons she had learned. Standing firm had not been easy. It had required patience, documentation, knowledge, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. There had been moments when she doubted herself, when anxiety threatened to take over. But she had discovered that strength was not about loud defiance. It was about steady resolve, about refusing to yield when the line was clear. Michael, too, carried a quiet pride. "We didn't just protect ourselves," he said one evening as they sat beneath the soft glow of the porch light. "We reminded everyone here that they have a voice. That matters." Their neighbors seemed to agree. A few weeks later, a small gathering was held at the park near the center of the community. Families brought picnic baskets, children played on the grass, and laughter filled the air. It was the kind of gathering that reminded everyone why they had chosen to live there in the first place. Several people approached Laura and Michael, offering thanks once more. For the couple, the gratitude was heartwarming, but the true reward was the sense of harmony slowly being restored. As the sun set that evening, Laura stood with Michael at the edge of the park, watching the colors streak across the sky. The ordeal with Ms. had tested them in ways they never expected, but it had also revealed something important. Peace was not simply given, it was built and protected. The community had learned that vigilance and unity were powerful tools. Authority, when left unchecked, could create fear. But when faced with calm strength, it could be balanced, redirected, and held accountable. Walking home together, Laura felt a quiet contentment settle over her. The road ahead would not be free of challenges. Life rarely was. But she knew that whatever came, they would face it with the same resolve that had carried them through this trial. Their home was more than a place to live. It was a testament to courage, patience, and the unyielding belief that boundaries, once set, deserved to be respected. That night, as they closed the front door and locked it behind them, Laura turned to Michael with a small smile. "Our home is safe," she said softly, "and so are we." Michael nodded, his expression warm and steady, safe and stronger than before. For the first time in what felt like forever, Laura slept soundly, her dreams undisturbed, her heart at peace. The ordeal was behind them, and in its place stood a new beginning, one built not on fear, but on unity, resilience, and the quiet strength of knowing they had stood firm together. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.